appreciate having the opportunity to hear your insights through this channel, in addition to your copious and wonderful and very important writing. So thank you so much for letting me have a chance to also see the face, hear the voice behind the words that have been so powerful for all of us.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. I wanted to share some musings with you, and I'm very excited about hearing your reaction to that. As you know, BEworks and is headquartered in Canada, and it's the month of July. And so looking at the difference in the responses to the pandemic between Canada and the US, I'm also American, reveals an interesting difference in how underlying beliefs and values can shape our behavior. And yes, this is a complex issue when it comes to these responses, and there isn't one underlying explanation, but one thing that stands out is that many Americans and only a few Canadians view the obligation to wear a mask as an infringement upon personal freedom. And here's an interesting reflection about this month of July, which is at the start of the month, we had the 4th of July in the US, a commemoration of independence, a celebration of the time in 1776 when 13 American colonies were no longer, subject to the monarch of Britain, and were now these free and independent states, versus in Canada, and the Canada Day celebration on July 1st, which is a celebration of unification, where 3 independent colonies were merged together. So on the one hand, we have a celebration of independence, and the other about unification. And this seems to parallel the responses by the citizens to the public health policies that are being implemented similarly in both nations. But in Canada, there isn't nearly as much protest against the use of masks or other freedom restricting approaches, such as lockdowns. But in the US, we even have the President of the United States objecting to these measures. So I have this huge question for you, Professor Sunstein, which is, I think that these reactions are based on a misunderstanding of freedom. Americans say they value freedom, but the Declaration of Independence spoke about the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty, not freedom. Liberty is not the same thing as freedom. And as John Locke says, and you have written about, freedom of people under government is to be under no restraint apart from standing rules to live by that are common to everyone in the society and made by the lawmaking power established in it. Persons have a right or liberty to follow their own will in all things that the law has not prohibited, and not be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, or unknown arbitrary wills of others. In other words, my reading of this is that liberty is a more compassionate view of freedom. It entails the responsible use of freedom under the rule of law without depriving anyone else of their freedom, or, as is a painful consequence in the case of COVID-19, life. So with that opening, I'm deeply interested in your thoughts on liberty and freedom and how addressing these beliefs might help us overcome the resistance to the scientific guidelines to managing COVID-19.
And I'm actually speaking from a house which was one of the places that British soldiers came on April 19, 1775, when American independence started. The War for Independence started actually at this location. This is Concord, Massachusetts. This is one of the handful of places that the British soldiers visited, and were very close, within walking distance of the North Bridge, which was where the shot heard round the world was fired. That was the shot that started the war, literally started the War for Independence, where the American farmers, one of whom lived in this house, defended themselves against British troops. Okay, so there's a lot in your question. One question is whether it's just a fact that the disparate paths, let's say, of Canada and the United States reflect deep cultural differences. And That might be true, but I'm just not sure. So where I'm speaking from now, again, is in New England. And in New England, there's a ton of mask wearing, and we've actually stabilized pretty well the COVID-19 transmissions. And there have been some areas in New England which have been extremely successful. There isn't cultural resistance in this part of America to wearing masks. I'm wondering, as you ask, whether we could imagine a scenario in which what's observed in large parts of the United States would be generally observed in the United States, or whether there's something in the culture that just makes that very unlikely. And I'm not sure. Often societies go on one path or another because of some serendipitous something that moves them in that direction. So is there something in the United States in particular that would lead to hashtag Me Too? That this was where it would start? Or Black Lives Matter, would the United States be necessarily a leader on those counts? Just not sure. The United States isn't number one in the world, I don't think. With respect to sex equality and racial equality, we have some spectacular achievements. Is it something in our culture, or is it that there's some path dependence here? And I think there's path dependence is at least a large part of it. The fact that some prominent leaders have been skeptical of mask wearing in various places has been important to cultural resistance to mask wearing. And, it might be a particular state where the governor says mask wearing, I'm not sure if that's a good idea, or it might be the president's influence on some occasions where he hasn't seemed that excited about mask wearing, though he shifted. And if it were a different governor, a different president. So just not sure whether there's a deep cultural account for what we're observing. It's possible, but I'd put a question mark next to that. With respect to liberty, the great philosopher John Rawls wrote in a manuscript he never published, we post a signpost, no deep thinking here, things are bad enough already. And this is a great philosopher who was cautious about how much progress we can sometimes at least make on the most fundamental issues. I think liberty, as you're describing it, has multiple possible meanings that are linguistically acceptable. So you could understand liberty in 101 different ways that wouldn't conflict with the dictionary definition. There is an understanding of liberty, which is that associated with John Stuart Mill, which is you can do what you want, so as long as you don't cause harm to others. That's one in the Western tradition, a very influential account. It's an understanding of liberty that's completely intelligible. And then we'd say, I think, very reasonably that if mask wearing is necessary to prevent harm to others, as the data seems to suggest it is, then a requirement that people wear masks doesn't infringe on liberty any more than a requirement that people not hit other people, or not, or a requirement that people get vaccinated, if that's the justification is so they don't make other people sick. So I completely agree that the mask wearing requirements that some places have aren't an infringement on liberty properly understood if they are understood as an effort to ensure against transmission by one person to another person. And as I say, in a lot of the United States, that's widely agreed. Now, in any culture where people are asked to do something that's quite new, if you said everyone has to wear a tie, all guys have to wear a tie, that would be sex discriminatory, I think. But if you said everybody has to wear a tie, that wouldn't be the most fun thing. And mask wearing is a little comparable to that in its not fun quality. But given the magnitude of the risks here, completely legitimate, and that seems now widely recognized in this country, with the president himself coming out very strongly in favor of mask wearing. A little later than I would have liked, maybe a lot later, but as they say, better late than never.
Awesome. I agree. I'm very happy that he's updated his position on this, which is something that is a fundamental insight in terms of scientific thinking. It's willing to recognize that one might have been wrong based on whatever information they had at the time, and then being willing to change their position when the facts suggest otherwise. And that's one of those fundamental principles of scientific thinking then. And I'd love your point of view on scientific thinking. David Wade Chambers, several decades ago, launched this activity called Draw a Scientist. And I've borrowed from this practice many, many, many times. And I've asked people to draw a scientist. And to this day, they still follow the same thing that he found decades ago, which is that people draw someone pretty much who looks like Rick from Rick and Morty or Albert Einstein. And it's so predictable that he was able to make a thing called the Draw a Scientist inventory and actually catalog, the crazy hair, the big glasses, the lab coat, the beaker. And with that is an implicit elitism and distancing between science and the thing that drives science, which is the scientific method and the process of scientific thinking. And so there's this chasm that we have in our society between scientific thinking and our everyday selves. And I fundamentally believe that scientific thinking is a tool that everyone should have access to, as it can really transform our knowledge and understanding of the truth. I'd love to hear your point of view on the relationship between scientific thinking and in your work, studying the Constitution, developing principles of libertarian paternalism, and how scientific thinking is ultimately important for democracy.
Well, I worked for 4 years in the White House, and two of my favorite offices were the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, which was run by a professor named John Holdren and composed of scientists, and the economic office, the Council of Economic Advisors in particular, which consists of what you could understand to be scientists. They were in well-functioning administrations. They are not really value-laden. They're trying to do the best they can with the economic data, and then to that extent, they are scientists too. And what is admirable in a democracy is that if you have a question like, is this chemical dangerous? Is it something which the Environmental Protection Agency say should ban? They will give you data on the risks. And what I loved about the scientists with whom I worked is they were completely unpredictable ideologically. They would say on Monday that the kind of environmentalists are full of nonsense. It's really not risky. Don't worry about it. And then on Thursday, they'd say, you know what, the environmentalists have it exactly right, and the risks associated with this chemical are pretty high, and regulation seems justified on public health grounds. So to have a significant role for scientists in a democracy is important and not anti-democratic. If the question is food safety policy, for example, you need to know something about the risks associated with lettuce under certain conditions, or the risks associated, the E. coli risks, let's say, associated with some things. And scientists will know that. It doesn't matter if they are 29-year-old women who don't wear glasses, or 77-year-old guys who have white hair like Einstein. The question is, do they know things that need to be known by policymakers or by the public? Highway safety, pandemic control, how to deal with nuclear power, how to deal with pesticides, how to deal with climate change. These all have a very large scientific component, and Walter Lippmann was an early thinker who was completely on top of the need for a very significant role for experts. Now, of course, sometimes experts disagree, And sometimes their disagreement is purely technical. Sometimes their disagreement involves values of their own, and it's very important to try to understand that. I found in the White House that scientific disagreement on the vast terrain of issues that bore on public policy is not mediated by values. It's just different assessment of very complicated scientific questions in which the data is uncertain. The degree of agreement, and now I'm talking not about economics, but about what in ordinary language more is pure science, the level of disagreement was crushed by the level of agreement.
Yeah, that's a very helpful analogy, and I appreciate you circling it back to it. It liberates what the evidence says from who the person is that is presenting that evidence, and that is a very important insight for us when we think about democracy, because it's not about those who may be more persuasive or have those attributes that are more stereotypically associated with people that have this persuasive appeal. And so it helps us cut through some of that potential bias that we all might implicitly have.
I think, for example, one of the most troublesome air pollutants from the standpoint of public health is particulate matter. And if the question is whether to be more aggressive, let's say in Canada or the United States, with respect to ambient air quality for particulate matter, where more aggressiveness will impose costs, possibly very significant costs, there's no way of even approaching that issue without getting a hold of the best available science. And abstractly to ask, how worried should we be about particulate matter is not helpful. I'm a lawyer and I don't have any expertise in that. If you do a poll on particulate matter, if you're lucky, people will know what you're talking about, but this isn't what they specialize in. So it's really indispensable to have scientists telling the policymakers, this is something really to worry about at existing levels, because X number of people are projected to die, or there's a lower bound of Y and an upper bound of Z. And then the policymaker often will find, now the decision's easy. I know the science, I know what to do. That happens a lot in governments, where once there's fixation on the facts, the value disagreement between the left and the right becomes completely uninteresting. And I found that and find that to the extent that I have an occasional advisor role, informal, with public officials, that value disagreements can be really important on issues like, abortion or economic equality. But on many of the questions, they become like background noise. Once you see, this chemical poses trivial risks, the scientists say. Should we regulate it? No. This chemical is a serious problem for children. Should we regulate it? There's a good argument that we should.
So this leads to the next question. So based on your work, libertarian paternalism is about changing the presentation of the choice set to help people align their own preferences and desired outcomes to their behavior. For instance, everyone wants to be healthy, wealthy, and wise, and yet we regularly engage in behaviors that hinder our achievement of those goals. Choice architecture takes those aspirations into consideration when adjusting the environment so that people are better positioned to maximize their own preferences. But what about when people's beliefs and actions are harmful to society? What should we do?
Okay, I describe libertarian paternalism a little differently from that. I'd say that libertarian paternalism doesn't mean framing options differently. It could include that, but it means an intervention that preserves freedom of choice but steers choice in a particular direction. So an example would be a calorie label, where you can see there's a lot of calories in something you find delicious. Now you know you've been steered a bit away from it, but it's up to you. Or a GPS device is libertarian paternalist. It gives you a route to the direction, to the destination you want, but you can say, I actually don't like that route. It's not pretty enough, or it involves too many back roads. I'm going to do the highway. It's a little longer. That's libertarian paternalist. If you're given a warning that this food contains, let's say, peanuts or shellfish, that's libertarian paternalist. And for those who have allergies, it's pretty strongly steering, but maybe it's a mild allergy, and maybe you think, okay, I'm going to take the risk. I wouldn't advise that, but some people do, and we're not talking about mandates. If you're automatically enrolled in let's say a healthcare plan or a program, an anti-poverty program when you're poor, but you can opt out, that's libertarian paternalist. That's not about framing an option. That's basically just shifting from opt-in to opt-out, which is the Olympic gold winner for libertarian paternalist. And I'll get to your question in a moment, I promise. But the trick for the libertarian paternalist is to make sure that the offering helps people get better off as judged by themselves. So the criterion is not, does the paternalist feel happy or proud? It's, does the actor feel I've been made better off? And that if someone gets a GPS device and sees the route indicated, in the overwhelming majority of cases, people think they're better off that way. And if people get warnings about, let's say, allergies or overuse of certain medications, they're overwhelmingly better off as a result. And if you get information about any number of things that accompany products you get, like automobiles or appliances, overwhelmingly, if the system's working right, people are better off because they know about the fuel economy of their car or the energy efficiency of their refrigerator. Okay, so that's what libertarian paternalism is about. If there's harm to others, now getting to your question, then we're not in that framework anymore. So if we're talking about, let's say, theft or assault or trespass, to have choice-preserving interventions isn't adequate. These are offices of the criminal law, which are mandates and bans. They are not freedom-preserving, because if someone's going to hit somebody else in the nose, it's not enough to say, you know, probably shouldn't do that, or the person's going to hurt if you do that. That's not adequate. So for things where people inflict harm on third parties, we might want to have a prohibition. We might want to have a requirement. We might want to have a tax. We might want to have a subsidy. So for environmental harm, often taxes and subsidies are on the table. Even in such cases, nudges and things that would, in the case of just harm to self, be cases for libertarian paternalism, have a place, a complementary place. So, for example, if we're talking about trespass, or if we're talking about discrimination, to have nudges of various kinds is really important to ensure compliance. And we observe them in multiple countries, and they are very cost effective if they're smart.
And how about in the case of beliefs, without running the risk of creating terrifying thought police? But what about in the case where the beliefs are harmful to society?
Well, if someone believes, let's say, what would be harmful to society, that people whose skin color is darker than yours don't feel pain, or people whose gender is different from yours can't do math. To have education and nudges is probably a good idea as part of what ensures, in those cases, equality. So belief police, that's not really a good idea, but an educational system, which includes, let's say, for adults, signals of what are prevailing norms and maybe even constitutional norms, uh, that's a pretty good idea.
Okay. What natural experiments do you see unfolding during the pandemic?
We have a lot of them. One is how different localities and educational systems respond to the risk of cases and whether the interventions being chosen by them are effective. We're seeing, and this is, in some ways a potential tragedy, but in some ways a great learning experience, is if in some place in Denmark, let's say they open the schools, what happens? And if another place in Denmark they don't open the schools, what happens? And if they have the same baseline condition, we can learn whether opening the schools is actually harmful.
Yes, yes, that's a great example of a way that we can systematically try things and evaluate the data. And it also teaches us how crucial it is to be very declarative of our assumptions and the beliefs about what we're hoping to find, so that when the events unfold in front of us, we're able to have a more objective view of what really happened, what didn't happen, what was our prediction. And so these natural experiments are very useful for us in a case where we don't necessarily have the time for a full-blown randomized control test.
Yes, the cautionary note here is that because people are dying, um, learning is less it's not an unambivalent source uh, of goodness that is when the stakes are low. But the good side is if it's the case that we can prevent future deaths in big numbers by learning what works and what doesn't work and what kinds of, let's say, transition steps actually aren't causing harm. That can be great for, let's say, opening up in a widespread way in the next months.
Yes. Um, so one of the important characteristics of scientific thinking is the willingness to change one's beliefs in the face of new evidence. And in the early days of COVID-19, you had a piece featured in Bloomberg on the perception of risk for COVID-19. And at the time, you were advocating, and again, this was back in March, I think it was very early days, that the risk might be overblown and that humans have a tendency to misperceive risk. We overweight small risks and we underweight things that are probably large risks. You had talked about this probability neglect as something that might explain some of the early reactions to COVID-19. I'd love to know your point of view now. And it turns out that it is a high risk. So what lessons do you have now in terms of your reflection on your former self on that position? What can we learn if you think that might have been a mistake in the evaluation? If the Cass Sunstein, who's one of the most brilliant scholars alive, says that had made a mistake, what can we all learn from that? What does that mean?
Well, as I remember that piece, which I think, I'm not sure I have the date right, but I think it was February 28th.
February 28th. Yeah, it was very, very, very early on.
I think it started by saying we don't know the magnitude of the risk, but many people are more scared than they ought to be.
Yeah.
And the claim wasn't that people undervalue small risks and overvalue large risks. The
Right.
claim was when an outcome is emotionally gripping, people are often more scared than they need to be. And that's a robust finding. And
Yes.
I stand by it for COVID-19. So I wrote it, and I used the word many people intentionally, where many could be hundreds or millions. I tend to think millions, but the word was intentional. There are a lot of people who are more scared than they need to be. And I was responding at the time to widespread fear among young people, including young people I know, who believed that their risk of dying from COVID was very high, like in the vicinity of 20 to 80%. These are uninfected people who thought, I'm going to die. And the claim is true that many individuals, and this is what the piece is about, thought their personal risk was higher than reality warranted. So the piece, insofar as it emphasized that many people have a higher fear of death, higher mortality fear, which I think the second sentence of the piece, I haven't looked at it for a while. And I think the first sentence was, we don't know the magnitude of the risk yet. It's true. There are many people who are thinking today that they're going to die and their personal risk is not high. And that's an important component of the problem. So I think I wrote in the next week or next 2 weeks a piece that emphasized that on cost-benefit grounds, aggressive precautionary measures are a really good idea. And there's no conflict between the two claims. Two propositions that don't contradict each other can both be true.
Can both be true.
So the piece was, I wouldn't write it exactly the same as if I was writing it today. I'd have some more cautionary notes. I think what I didn't state was something that I thought was kind of self-evident, which is that in the context of a pandemic, we might have had exponential growth, which meant that it could go out of control. At that time, it wasn't clear it was going to, but I had some sense, unless we get it under control, some things follow. But it just is the case that many people today are suffering more fear than reality warrants. Now, fear can be a very good thing because it can justify precautions, but it's a terrible welfare loss if people are thinking, I'm going to die, when in fact their personal risk is not very high. Wear a mask, maybe go home. Precautions are good. Buckle your seatbelts. But the risk that you're going to die, live your life. Don't despair. And when I say many, it's not a majority. Most people, I hope, aren't thinking in any country, I'm going to die. But a lot of people are. And that's a terrible way to go about your year, thinking I'm going to die, thinking I'm going to be okay in all likelihood, and I'm going to do everything I can to maximize that possibility for myself and others is good. But to do it with kind of optimism and determination rather than with, rampant anxiety. So I do know that many people read that piece to say something that I really didn't say, and that's probably my fault. So probably I shouldn't write for popular audiences. I think that's the lesson.
Well, I think it's very important that you do, because the lessons there are very relevant for what looks like a very optimistic potential of a vaccine. And the same things that you said about people overestimating the probability of harm to themselves is being applied now to the vaccine.
Okay, so the dynamics of vaccine hesitancy are pretty complicated. And I wouldn't want, without data, to say that vaccine hesitancy is a product of probability neglect, where probability neglect is the salience of the bad outcome, with relative neglect of the probability that it will occur. It would be surprising if that isn't a component of vaccine hesitancy, but the best data I'm aware of on vaccine hesitancy points to a kind of act-omission bias, where letting nature take its course by not getting vaccinated seems more appealing than taking an actual step that might cause harm. And Jonathan Barron has done some very good work on vaccination and an asymmetry between people, how people act to acts and how people react to acts and how people react to omissions. Cornelia Betsch in Germany has done some terrific work on vaccine hesitancy, and I'd want to understand the recent data better than I now do before pronouncing. But clearly part of it is the salience of the act of getting vaccinated, accompanied by the harm that vaccination people fear will produce, which is for some more motivating than the less salient, indeterminate risk of what happens if you just live your life without the vaccine.
Extremely important distinctions. Thank you so much for that. It helps to elucidate the complexity of understanding how humans are biased in different ways, how that shapes our understanding, and how that informs our behavior in ways that might inhibit the best outcomes for ourselves and for humanity. So I'm very grateful for your time and reflections on science. But before I let you go back to your research, I have one more question for you, which is, how are you managing to keep up your squash game now?
Thank you for asking. I have, let's call it squash bias, which is the salience of the closure of the squash courts looms large in my mind, though probably not in most people's minds. So the squash courts here where I live were closed for a long time. They're now open, but you are not allowed to play with another member of the human race, except if you do something called drills, which are really boring, where the other member of the human race stands there and you stand there and you hit it kind of cross court. So I've played a little bit of squash, but there's a new sport. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. It's a little like squash, not as much running, not quite as much of a, athletic challenge. It's called tennis. I think they invented it after COVID-19 to help squash players, survive. And it's outdoors, which is nice. The ball, it's easier to hit. It's much bigger, and seems like a pretty good new sport. Maybe it'll catch on.
Uh, a sacrilege to many squash players and triumph for many tennis players. That's wonderful to hear that you're able to stay engaged in the racket sports.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. It's a joy to see you.
Great pleasure both ways. Thanks, Kelly.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much.